This is Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. On the show, you'll hear from innovators in the food space. We'll have disruptive conversations with people from around the globe who are taking the lead on topics like food sustainability, ending world hunger, food security, and so much more. I'm your host, Paul Newnham. In this episode, we're talking to Sam Kass, former White House Senior Policy Advisor and Executive Director of Let's Move. He started as the Obama's personal chef and went on to shape national food policy at the highest level. We explore his unique journey from kitchen to White House and his vision for America's food future. You'll hear about cooking for the president, how he transformed school lunches across the nation, and we'll discuss the current political climate in the US and what can be done about that. Let's get into it. Sam, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, man. Great to be here.
Let's start with, where did your career begin? Where did you learn to be a chef?
Well, my first cooking job was in Chicago. I was in college. It was the University of Chicago. And I had always liked to cook and always sort of wanted to learn how to really cook, but really it was for my future kids one day. I was just a college kid then. And I said that to my friend's boyfriend, who was sous chef of this kind of Italian-American spot in downtown Chicago. And so I said one day I want to go to culinary school, and he invited me in to kind of help out in the kitchen, and I ended up just sort of staying and coming and working and learning. And finally, the chef there was like, "Well, I guess you're gonna keep showing up. I need to start paying you." So I worked there for a summer. I didn't know anything, but I got started there. And then when I went to Vienna to finish my undergraduate degree, and that's where I got myself into a very high end restaurant and ended up learning how to cook there.
And on this journey, who's kind of inspired you, or what inspired you on that journey?
At that point, and sous chef in Vienna were a real inspiration. They were amazing chefs and had a really interesting take on food, a lot of humor, great technique. I was there for over a year and a half. I ended up staying in the sous chef's apartment. He moved in with his girlfriend, and they paid me in food and knowledge and just kicked my ass. And during that process, I started really understanding the impact that food was having on people's health, and started digging into those issues and those questions, and realizing, like, wow, we have a huge set of issues globally around the food we're eating and the impact on our health. And also, it was more nascent back then, but also issues around the environment, how we're producing our food, and some of the issues that were being created from our food system. And I started digging into those questions really early on in my training, which really put me on a totally different path. And when I started reading food policy books and history of agriculture books and food taxation, I was reading everything I could get my hands on. And yeah, so there's lots of people who inspired me, of course. Mary Nessel, Michael Pollan, Alice Waters, of course. She's everybody's fairy godmother in the food movement, at least over here in the United States. She's a dear friend. But lots of people inspired me along the way.
So your journey kind of continued, and something we never really think about is sometimes the world's most powerful people have chefs cooking for them. So how did you end up cooking for President Obama in the White House? What was that journey?
Yeah, so I was cooking actually in New Zealand. I cooked a couple of seasons in New Zealand for a family down there. At that point, I was just trying to travel and see the world. And I came back to Chicago after kind of 5 years of sort of cooking and traveling my way around the world. It was sort of time to take the backpack off my back. And I had known them a bit in high school, and the family that I was cooking for, the dad bumped into Michelle on a flight, and they got to talking. And now President Obama, but then Senator Obama, had just launched his campaign. He was a couple months into the campaign. And, Michelle had two young kids, a big job, and a husband who is now gone, and pressure to start campaigning, and no help. Like, literally, it was just grandma. So it was good timing. I mean, at that point, I came back wanting to work on food policy and politics. I thought there was a huge opportunity to organize chefs around these policy issues, and a bunch of untapped power there that was just not being utilized or organized. So third day or something, I was back. A week I was back, I guess. I got reconnected with Michelle and started helping the family out every other night. So during the campaign.
So what was that like going from cooking and traveling and everything into this kind of crazy journey of a campaign, and I imagine dealing with things constantly changing and everything else?
It was exciting, from the beginning, and they're wonderful people, but like nobody thought he had a chance. And there was one night, Michelle and I got very caught up in what would be possible for us to do if we got into the White House. And she writes about this in her book, so I can tell the story. She had started to see the impact on herself and the girls in terms of the better nutrition, and they were feeling good, and all their health numbers had improved when they went to the doctors. So, like, she was really seeing the impact of better nutrition on the well-being of her family. And we said, okay, if we got in there, we could plant a garden, and if that garden went well, then we could launch a big health campaign for families. We'd probably focus on kids to make it more harder to attack, and we could do a huge health movement. Da, da, da. So we got super excited about all the possibilities, and then we were like, this guy's name is Barack Hussein Obama. Like, he's 30 points down the polls. Like, this, what are we talking about here? We started laughing at how excited we got, and more just questioning whether the country was ready for a guy like him. And then turns out the country was. And so, yeah, that was kind of a once in a lifetime experience. Things like cooking dinner on election night, just me and the family. Moments like that were pretty extraordinary.
And so you went from working in as kind of a chef to being the US president's senior advisor for Healthy Food Initiative. So that conversation that you had with Michelle kind of became a reality. What was that like? And obviously working on food policy, which was something that you were passionate about right from the beginning.
We went in knowing that what we, had on a high level, knowing what we wanted to do. Obviously, the details of the strategy had to be worked out. Nothing prepares you for working in the White House unless you've been there before. It is on an order of magnitude unlike anything else in the world, or at least in the US. And it's intense. And I had a few different roles, right? Like, I was still cooking 5 nights a week, and I was sort of tasked to sort of help lead and develop her biggest initiative and work in the West Wing on the presidential side as a sort of policy advisor on that, on any kind of food issues. So the work with Michelle and then that policy work had a lot of overlap, but there was some difference there. And you show up on inauguration day like, I got to cook dinner, and where's the fridge? Like, this stuff I asked for to show up. So there's a lot to just orient, and nobody had ever taken on food issues from the White House before. Like, I was the first person in the history of the White House that has the title of nutrition in it. It was all new. There's no like roadmap. There was no playbook to run. There was none of that had been developed before. And so, yeah, we were kind of building it as we went. And I'm not a political animal. So the other thing is, I wasn't, I guess I should say. I certainly cut my teeth in that place. But like, it is highly competitive. You're on the same team, but like, everybody's fighting for their priorities, and there are trade-offs to be made, and tensions between issues, and people don't play very nice all the time. So you got to learn how to both play the internal game and then play the external game. Now you're fighting huge vested interests who do not want to see change, and that's intense. So your fights on multiple levels, and then you got to go cook dinner.
I mean, that must be grounding as well, though, I guess, in terms of the practice and the conversation. What are some of the key things you learned, particularly to do with nutrition during your time working in the administration?
Well, from like a policy and funding standpoint, the earlier you go, the bigger the bang for your buck you get. So focusing your dollar, like the first 100 days, the first 1,000 days, those are the most important periods. Obviously, you can't stop supporting the nourishment of children after that if you want to get good health outcomes. But those are often underfunded and undersupported, and dollar for dollar will have the biggest impact on developmental issues, capacity to learn, physical growth, all those things. So that's definitely an area that I learned. In fact, when we first launched the effort, we didn't have that in the initial take. We quickly added it when people kind of looked at what we put out as sort of, here's our framework. They're like, you're missing a big piece, and we got very educated on that. And they were totally right. And every piece of data you're ever going to see is going to reinforce that. So that's sort of one high level, just to answer that question. I mean, I think the other thing that you realize is that while policy is very important and there's huge things that can and need to get done, like we're not eating what we eat because of any policy. It does shape the playing field. The good policy can enable the proper change. There's all kinds of things for it to do. But in the end, people are eating what they're eating at a foundational level because of our culture, who we understand ourselves to be, what our preferences are, what our identities are. And if you don't address the underlying culture that shapes both what we eat and our politics, policy's not going to get you that far. And so often, I think advocates are just like, the government just needs to fix this. And the government can't fix food. The government has a role to fix food, but it is not the problem and it's not the solution. It's not the entirety of the problem or even the majority of the problem, frankly, and it's not the majority of the solution. You're not going to fix it without it. So don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it doesn't have a role, but I think it's often overstated. It's very convenient, the narratives around there's this big conspiracy. The food companies have partnered with government to kill us all and make money off our death. And there's some truth to any conspiracy. And there's definitely some truth to that. And every country is different. In some places, it's more that way than others. In the US, there's plenty of bad policy and plenty of policy that is shapes a lot of the landscape. But in the end, like that's not really how it's played out. And that's not what's going to change it. Like nobody can come in there and just fix it. It goes way more complicated than that.
You've just had a TED Countdown documentary just released. What do you think is a better food future from your perspective? What does it look like?
Well, I mean, the TED Countdown is based on this dinner that I do called the Last Supper, which you've been to. First one I did was actually at COP 21 in Paris, so 10 years ago, and I just did one a few weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference. And I realized like 10 fucking years of doing these dinners, talking about all the foods that are going to be lost to our kids and grandkids because of climate change. And it's not like exotics like coffee, wine, chocolate, shellfish, crustaceans, nuts, stone fruit. Like it's a long list. And some of that stuff will be gone and some of it will be super expensive. Like a cup of coffee is going to be for rich people. Chocolate will be like caviar. And then there's all the big commodities, and that's what really is. Wheat, rice are going to be decimated, and food insecurity is going to absolutely explode, and malnutrition is going to continue to grow, and political instability and forced migration, like all these things are going to start to happen. But when I first did it 10 years ago, it was like way in the future. It felt like it was really about my grandkids.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And now it's playing out right now, all over the world. Every time I do one of these things, there's a new ingredient with a new collapse. Georgia peaches last year, 95% of the crop was lost. The snow crab and salmon fisheries in the west coast of the U.S. have been closed for 2 years. They're almost certainly going to be closed for the third in a row because there are no crabs and there are no salmon. So, like, every year just gets worse. And obviously, things are a complete shit show in America right now. And it's hard to put a rosy picture on the future of food. I could sit here and tell you some utopic dream I have, but I think the reality is right now, in the face of no country being on track to meet their targets, the US pulling out of the COP agreement, which gives countries like India and China the license to just do whatever they want. And Europe's kind of on an island. And, I think essentially the reality is that we face is, at least a 2 degree, probably a 3 degree future. And we're moving in our own minds, but I think there's an evolution of thinking that's happening. But I think the reality, regardless of how long it takes for us to catch up to the reality, I think the reality is, and we still need to reduce our footprint to prevent full catastrophe. But we're now moving into an adaptation and resilience phase. And the question becomes, how do we both reduce dramatically the impact of our food system having on the natural systems of the world, which obviously is probably the number one driver of environmental degradation, including emissions around the world, if you take into water and biodiversity loss, et cetera. But we also have to figure out how to grow food in a resource constrained, highly volatile climate, which is just not what we have built a system around. We built our food system around the most stable climate that's basically scientists observe in the historical record on planet Earth. The last 1,000 years have been this like beautiful time to be an animal or plant, planet Earth. And we've had endless supply of the fundamental resources that sustain us: soil, water, and energy. And all that's is already depleted. And ever more so. I think the reality is like we have to get serious about how do we adapt and start building a much more resilient food system for the future forces that are going to shape our ability to feed ourselves. And we got to get serious about that because there's been for a long time, understandably so, scientists and advocates have been very hesitant to talk about that because they didn't want to take the pressure off of the broader economy to decarbonize. And they were right in some regard about that. Like, you don't want to say, okay, well, we don't have a shot on really hitting our targets, so let's sort of pivot. You're like, no, we got to hit our targets because, like, while we need to move to that, it's going to come at a huge cost and a lot of pain and suffering and loss of quality of life around the planet. So it doesn't mean we can take our foot off that pressure, but I do think we got to get much more serious around evolving our capacity to feed ourselves.
Yeah, no, I definitely would agree with you that the need for us to diversify in that process and think differently about different crops and not have a global system, rather have more localized and regional systems that make more sense, I think is critical. You were talking about the current political situation. How are you seeing the changes affect the food space? Like, what are you most worried about with food?
I want to just apologize to everybody listening to what's happening in this country. I want everybody around the world who's listening to this. There's a lot of Americans here who do not vouch for this, do not support it, will resist it, and do our best to fight it. Although they have complete control of every function of government and the richest man in the world funding a campaign of fear of basically anybody who's going to resist on the Hill in Congress somebody will get a big check to run against them. So everybody's terrified, and the companies are all terrified. There's a fear that's pervasive here right now. I'd say like it's a weird thing too, though, because the Secretary of Health and Human Services has made food reform a huge part, the like core to his platform, besides being an anti-vaxxer. So like he talks a big critique, a lot of which I actually agree with, but there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theory underneath it, and it'll be very interesting to see what they end up trying to do, and that all the details on the actual plan. Nobody has any sense of what their plan is. In fact, they just put out a plan to come up with a plan.
We've seen that before.
I actually think they could get a lot of stuff done because what he has done is made this issue bipartisan on the health side in a way that when we were in the White House, we got all these same people were fighting us to the death. Republicans fought us on everything. So who knows? They could get a lot done, and we'll see. No matter what they can get done, the devastation that's being done to our federal government across the board, and particularly on climate and environmental protection, will vastly outweigh whatever progress that he can make over there. So things that make me super worried are the pullback on every climate related policy and environmental protection that we have, the pausing and pulling back on money that actually already was dedicated to projects around regenerative agriculture and more resilient agriculture. All that's been frozen, and actually people who've been promised the money, they're now not getting it. We'll see what happens with that. There's going to be a lot of lawsuits around that. The gutting of the Environmental Protection Agency. We have a bird flu epidemic here. Like we are losing birds left and right, and they just fired the people who are dealing with bird flu. FEMA, the natural disaster group that, when there's a flood or the fires or whatever, they come in to help people. They just said they're going to try to cut that agency by 84%. So it's just like literally the worst thing you could possibly do in the face of climate change. So like our capacity to manage all these issues is just being completely decimated. I think the thing ultimately, though, that really does worry me the most and has a ripple effect globally is the cultural pullback on these issues. So when you have no threat of policy, there's no stick, and you have nobody in leadership in the White House talking about these issues, pushing forward an agenda, it sends a very powerful signal to the country that this doesn't matter. And certainly to the corporate America and corporates around the globe, these multinational corporations, of course, all the big ones are operating around the globe, that they don't have to spend money to change their operations. And that will take, I don't know how many years, but many, many, many years to recover from. Like you can change a policy when the next person comes in, but like getting a company to reestablish their operations, and we can't lose 5 more years on this. We don't have 5 years. And when the rest of the world looks at that, yes, there will be some people who step up even bigger than they would, and that the optimists will say, well, there's our moment to double down. We can do more. And yes, and that's true, and we have to. But the broader cultural pullback, I really worry because it's the cultural values that are shape who gets elected. It shapes what their policies are. It shapes what we eat. It shapes our decisions. And that really does worry me.
Having worked in the White House and having sort of insights into presidential decisions and being responsible for a lot of good in the US, if you could step in to make some changes today so that everyone does have nutritious, affordable food, what would you do?
For me, I would have a program focused on diversifying the food system in every level, the people working in it, the styles of operations, and the kinds of crops that we're growing. Right now, we have all of our eggs, and this is true basically on a global basis, in just a few baskets. And I think food and agriculture is the only system on planet Earth that can actually sequester enough carbon in the time horizon that we sort of have left to make a real difference. And so I would start to invest heavily. And Secretary Vilsack, in the Biden administration, did a very good job getting this going. We just needed more time and resource. But I would go heavy into dramatically expanding supports and incentives for transitioning production systems to regenerative practices. And I think ultimately, I would start with very seriously establishing a robust carbon market in the United States because that is the way, with partnered with better technology and tools that are coming online, that we can start to pay farmers to do the right thing. And like right now, we have not figured out this transition is a pretty significant price tag to it. We cannot figure out who's going to pay for it. And we want farmers to change how they're doing it. There'll always be enough farmers who are visionary or because of their particular situation are kind of forced into abandoning some old ways and trying something different. But system wide, nobody's changing from a systemic standpoint. And it's because the numbers don't work for them. It's too much risk, and the return on that risk is not high enough. I think the only way that that really changes is that the people who are destroying the planet, the big emitters, are the ones who pay for the transition. And I think carbon is the way into that. I think ultimately we have to price the ecosystem services that our natural ecosystems are providing for us to sustain life on planet Earth. We have to start pricing. We have to put a sense of value to that. Like right now, every acre, in fact, I'm heading to the Amazon tomorrow. Every acre that gets chopped down in the forest is to graze cattle or plant soy. That farmer is making a logical decision because that forest is worth whatever it is per hectare, and they can get that much more for those cattle. And we have to make it so that it will make more economic sense to preserve these natural ecosystems, which do provide all sustain our lives, and the mangroves that sustain our fisheries, and the forests that create the air and protect our water. All these things has to have a price on it. So I would focus on reshifting how we assess value and how we start paying our production system, our producers, to do the right thing. And I think if you did that, and you did that with that mind towards a much more diverse diet, and you deploy technology innovation that is here, that's really not being adopted because of some of the incentives and costs associated with that, but you can start to work that in. I think you could have a highly nutrient dense food system that is affordable, which is critical, and do it in a way that really starts, that preserves the natural resources. And of course, the first thing we do in that diversity is beans, right?
Yeah, of course.
Beans would be the champion, the Trojan horse of how we diversify. And we'd start going crop by crop and looking at what we could do to get better food into the system.
To close things out, we like to ask a bit of a recurring question that we can all relate to. What are you enjoying eating at the moment?
Well, I have some chicken thighs in buttermilk and a little buttermilk brine, overnight buttermilk brine, which I do love, I must say, which I'm about to go roast. And my kids just walked in the door. And so I do have to get those in the oven before there's a mutiny on my hands. They would tell you that my bolognese is their favorite thing. What am I loving eating? I'm also going to roast a red cabbage with some sherry vinegar. So that's a delicious thing.
It's not the season for your vegetable garden.
Yeah, I'm looking out the window at a complete blizzard.
I'm in Australia in summer and we've got the glut of like, I'm feeding the parrots apples because I've got that many, and there's like we're trying to work out 25 ways to use pumpkin, and all that kind of stuff.
Way to rub it in, man. Thanks for that.
Don't look at my Instagram feed.
And
Well, always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us on the show. This has been really insightful and looking forward to, I know you mentioned there's a book coming out, so looking forward to hearing that.
Yep.
And continue to hold in there, and hopefully you will get back into a spot where you can implement that diversity of change.
Yeah, let me just say one last thing before we go, which is it's a tough moment right now, especially over here, which I'm sure you can pick up on. We still have an incredible opportunity to transform our system to a far more resilient, equitable, and nourishing system to feed people around the globe. And we have to. And there will be opportunities that emerge even from these difficult times that give us a chance to make more progress than ever. And I will just say, while I can, I just want to thank you for your tireless work advocating around the world, trying to make these things happen in all kinds of different ways. I'm like, dude, is he ever home? Like, you are always on the road trying to get to the people who can make a difference, fighting the good fight. And I just want to say I am grateful, and the world is better for it, for all those efforts for you and your team. So thank you for all you do, man.
Thank you, Sam. Really appreciate it.
All right, man. We'll talk soon.
You've been listening to Future Fork, a show that explores the world of food and the decisions we can make today that will shape our future. Future Fork is produced by Disruptive Consulting Solutions and supports the SDG2 Advocacy Hub. For more info, head to the website futureforkpodcast.com. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Wavelength Creative. So you don't miss an episode of Future Fork, make sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Paul Newnham, and I'll see you in the next episode.